Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today I'm looking at the ontological argument for God's existence as presented by inspiring philosophy. So let's get to the question begging.
Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument is probably the best argument for the existence of God.
No, strong disagree. I find the "just look around you, man" argument to be infinitely more convincing than this one.
It uses the laws of modal logic and acts similar to a mathematical proof.
Except it's philosophy, not mathematics, so no matter how airtight you think you've got it, somebody somewhere will disagree. I don't see anyone disagreeing with 1 + 1 = 2, but say anything philosophical and I can find you a whole group of people who will insist that you are wrong.
This is probably why a lot of people have a hard time understanding it and simply dismiss it.
I usually just dismiss it because of how ridiculous it is, but when you said at the beginning that it's the best proof of God, I just couldn't resist responding.
There are many great videos on the internet right now that give a great analysis of the ontological argument, yet many people ignore these videos because they find them too confusing. In this video, I'm going to try to articulate the argument in an easy way to understand.
If you don't know what the ontological argument is yet, then prepare to be blown away. It's not that it's too confusing, it's that it's completely and utterly silly.
Because if you're a theist, then it's important to understand this argument, because when understood correctly, it is impossible to refute.
Just as impossible to refute as everything spouted by Sci-10 Brigancate. That's foreshadowing, because it's circular, just like Psi. And jokes are funnier when you explain them.
If you don't believe in a God, then it would probably be a good idea to understand it, so you don't appear foolish by misunderstanding it.
Agreed. So what is this amazing argument of which you speak?
To start, here's how the modal ontological argument works. Premise 1. It is possible that God exists.
I disagree, but I will let him get through the rest of the premises, and I will present my objections while he makes his clarifications later.
Premise 2. If it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. And premise 5. If God exists in the actual world, then God exists. Now, if you're like me when you first heard this, you're probably asking, well, wait, that doesn't make any sense. The logic of some of those premises doesn't add up.
Yeah, I'll say, I agree with that statement 100%.
That's okay, because we're going to look at it closer so you can understand it. First, you should understand that when philosophers say a possible world, they mean a hypothetical situation. It is generally a way for philosophers to test an idea to see if it's logical by asking, could it exist in a possible world like ours?
Fair enough, it does seem to be a good philosophical tool.
However, the one thing people seem to misunderstand the most in the argument is how God is defined.
Yeah, but no matter how you define God, the logic still doesn't add up. Again, we'll come back to this later.
Some atheists say we're just imagining God into existence, like this clever bunch.
So here's my proof that a unicorn exists, and I actually wrote this passage. So let's define a unicorn as a magical equine being that has one horn and exists. By the above definition, such a being must exist. Therefore, a unicorn exists.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the ontological argument.
It's very hard to believe that there are people that use that, but there are.
The fact that the idea is there, that so I can believe that I'm green and polka dotted.
Apparently.
No, not quite. This gets to the crux of the matter. Just believing that you are green and polka-dotted does not fit in this argument. In order for it to work in this argument, you have to believe that you must be green and polka-dotted. So you have to define yourself as green and polka-dotted in a way that existence requires you to be green and polka-dotted.
As
Okay.
long
Yes, apparently.
So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am green with purple polka dots. And since I have stated that, therefore it must be true.
since you can imagine
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the problem. They are falling into the typical error of misunderstanding how God is defined, and because of their ignorance, they are concluding that the argument doesn't work. So we need to look at how God is actually defined and how it differs from how you would define a unicorn.
Well, I think that his unicorn was properly defined, since he included the caveat that it must exist in his statement.
Now there are three ways to define a being or an entity in the ontological argument. An entity can either be impossible, which means it exists in no possible worlds. An example would be a square circle. An entity can be contingent, which means it exists in some possible worlds, like a unicorn. A unicorn could exist in some possible worlds, but not in others. Last, an entity can be necessary, which means it has to exist in all possible worlds. Now, what do we mean when we say something necessarily has to exist in all possible worlds?
Good question, but more to the point, how do you show that something necessarily exists in all possible worlds?
Well, examples of necessary entities are numbers, absolute truths, and shape definitions. For example, take the number 2. No one created it, it just exists necessarily. It can't not exist. Take a shape definition for another example, such as a square must have 4 sides. A square cannot exist with only 3 sides, because that would be logically incoherent in any possible world.
I agree with the numbers, but are you saying that it's impossible to imagine a world that is like ours for the most part, but nothing in that world has 4 equal sides? Yes, I'm nitpicking, but I don't think a square is a necessary item. In fact, if you want to get super nitpicky, it's possible that squares don't even exist in our world. If you measure precisely enough, all 4 edges will be slightly different lengths, if only by microscopic amounts, possibly even getting down to how many atoms it's off by. So quadrangles, yes. Squares, not necessarily.
So a necessary entity is something that cannot be false or fail to exist in any possible world. Therefore, necessarily, it has to exist in all possible worlds.
And such things are purely definitional. Anything that is more than just its own definition is not a necessary item.
So when we talk of God in this argument, we are saying that if he exists, he would have to be a necessary entity, because God is defined as a maximally great being.
And why does a maximally great being have to exist? What is necessary about a maximally great being?
And a maximally great being is defined as a being that possesses all qualities that are better to have, which we define as great-making properties.
Okay, but that is just one huge question-begging fallacy. To beg the question is to assume the conclusion of the argument while making the argument. You are assuming that because you can think a being has necessity as a property, a being must therefore exist with necessity as a property. But what you have demonstrated about the property of necessity is that it is only possessed by things that are purely definitional. By the logic of this argument, you could literally demonstrate any fantasy creature to exist simply by asserting that it possesses the quality of necessity. That is why the unicorn example holds up. You can't just assert that something is necessary, you must demonstrate it. I accept that the number 2 is necessary because any world with things in it, there will be more than one thing, and one of the number groupings will always be what I understand to be 2, even if different language was used to describe it. I do not accept that God is necessary. This is not an airtight argument against the God of the Bible, though, as if you actually read the Bible, it is made very clear several times that Yahweh is not omniscient, omnipotent, or omnibenevolent.
Other examples are love, wisdom, and power. A maximally great being would also have to have these properties to their maximal extent.
Except that the problem of evil demonstrates that a being with all 3 of those properties cannot possibly exist in our world. Quick rehash of the problem of evil: a being who knows every way in which evil could come into existence, omniscience, and who is able to prevent that evil, omnipotence, and who wants to prevent that evil, absolute benevolence, would prevent that evil. But evil exists, therefore no omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being exists.
He would also possess no qualities that are bad to have, such as imperfection or corruption.
I know that we haven't really touched on proving which God might be the one who exists from this, but if you're talking about the God of the Bible, then both of those are demonstrably wrong.
These are defined as lesser-making properties. But most of all, he would have to possess the great-making property of necessity, because being necessary is a property that would be better to have.
So because it's a property that is better to have, and I can imagine something having it, that thing must then exist. Yeah, that's clearly not question-begging or circular at all.
Now looking back at the terms we defined earlier, if God was contingent, he wouldn't be maximally great, because he would only exist in some worlds.
Agreed, but why did you skip over impossible? I think that one fits him pretty well. I mean, either he is impossible or necessary in philosophical terms, and you have not yet demonstrated that he is not impossible. So why are we ruling that out? Keep in mind, I'm speaking philosophically. Scientifically speaking, I would concede that yes, there is technically a possibility, but only in the same sense that any other mythological figure is also possible. It's possible that the wizarding world of Harry Potter exists and they hide it extremely well from muggles like me. But philosophically speaking, the Harry Potter world is impossible in that it exists in no possible worlds, when you consider the philosophical definition of a possible world to be an imaginary world that is similar to ours. Man, philosophy can be tiring.
And would be less than great than if he existed in all worlds. Now, the idea of God being necessary is consistent with Scripture. Colossians 1:16 says, "For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him."
Okay, if you're going to use Scripture, then so am I. Remember back when you said,
He would also possess no qualities that are bad to have, such as imperfection or corruption.
Well, here's some imperfection for you. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me. How would an omniscient and omnipotent being have regrets? He knew what he would regret, and had the ability to make sure it didn't happen. So did he make it so he would regret on purpose? Then it's not really regret, and therefore the Bible is inaccurate.
So when skeptics try to debunk this argument by going through the premise with a unicorn in place of God, they are trying to define God in the same way you would define a contingent being.
He defined a unicorn as something that must exist, as in it is a necessary being. So using the ontological argument, necessary unicorns do exist, as does the flying spaghetti monster and anything else that you can think of as having the trait of necessity.
Whereas when we use God in the ontological argument, we are saying God is more than just contingent. He is maximally great, and anything maximally great must be a necessary entity.
But you haven't demonstrated that God is, in fact, maximally great. And I have demonstrated, using your reference book, that God is not, in fact, maximally great. So even if a maximally great being exists, it is not the God of the Bible.
Or it wouldn't be maximally great. So understanding how God is defined in the argument, let's go through the premises again. Premise 1. It is possible that God, a maximally great and necessary being, exists.
Please demonstrate the possibility. Being able to imagine it doesn't count. Premise 1 is an assumed conclusion, so the whole argument is flawed.
Premise 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds. Remember, if a maximally great being exists, then he has to be a necessary entity.
And if a maximally great being does not exist, then all of this goes out the window. You still have not demonstrated premise 1.
Because a contingent being cannot be maximally great. Premise 4. If a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world.
Nope. Just because you can imagine something as having the property of necessity does not mean that it actually does have that property in reality. So even if premise 1 wasn't based entirely on a logical fallacy, premise 4 fails because imagination does not make reality.
Because the actual world is counted as one of the possible worlds. Premise 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. And the conclusion is, a maximally great being exists.
A conclusion that was assumed in premises 1 and 4 without ever once being demonstrated.
So does it feel convincing? Well, not really.
Glad we can agree on something.
But when it boils down, it's not a matter of how you feel. What matters is what is logically coherent.
And since this argument is not logically coherent, it can then be dismissed. Thanks.
So hopefully now that you know how God is defined in the argument, you can understand how the ontological argument works. Are there objections to the argument? Yes, but only in premise 1.
Well, and premise 4, but even if the only objection was premise 1, I feel kind of like, if your whole argument is dependent on a flawed premise, it's probably not a sound argument.
Since the other premises just follow modal logic and are uncontroversial. The only way for skeptics to debunk this argument is to show that it is impossible for a maximally great being to exist.
Not really. This is where the burden of proof comes in. Until you demonstrate that it's actually possible, it can be assumed that it's not, at least in this very narrow thought experiment.
The most common way this is tried is with the omnipotence paradox. It is most commonly presented like this. Can God create a stone so heavy that even he can't move? If God cannot create the stone, then he is not all-powerful. But if God can create the stone and can't move it, then he is still not all-powerful. Therefore, the idea of God is impossible.
Yeah, sounds good. Omnipotence by itself does not make any sense for that very reason. Now pair it with omniscience and omnibenevolence, and you have the holy trinity of bullshit.
However, this attempt is debunked in the question itself as a logical absurdity. Asking can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy even he can't move implies that omnipotence is defined as able to do the logically impossible.
Well, I mean, it kind of follows that if you have the property of omnipotence, which means you have the power to do absolutely anything, then yeah, that would include the power to do something that is logically impossible. I mean, I thought you guys believed that God created logic, so it stands to reason that he could have created it differently or altered it to make what is currently logically impossible, possible.
Which is not consistent with the definition of omnipotence. No one who believes in an omnipotent God believes God can do the logically impossible.
How the fuck is it almighty power if it isn't the power to do everything? I mean, that's the one definition of omnipotent, is having unlimited power and able to do anything.
The Bible has verses that state it's impossible for God to do certain things.
Yes, it does. And as I pointed out earlier, the Bible is an excellent source for demonstrating that the biblical God cannot possibly have all the attributes that modern Christians believe he has. Glad we can agree on that. Also, if God cannot be tempted with evil, does that mean that Jesus isn't God since he was tempted with evil in the desert? Also, you left out the second part of that verse, which states that God does not tempt anyone. Genesis 22:1 says that God did tempt Abraham.
Asking the question is like asking, can an omnipotent being create a square with 3 sides?
If he is truly omnipotent, then yes. It may involve altering all of history to swap the definition of square and triangle, but he can do it if he's omnipotent.
Or can an omnipotent being tell you the shape of purple? Or can an omnipotent being toad in 11? It's just gibberish.
It is gibberish, but it's also possible for an omnipotent being. Also, I would like to point out that those aren't logical impossibilities. Those are definitional impossibilities. There is a huge difference. A logical impossibility would be more like that, can he create a rock that's so heavy that even he can't lift it? That's a logical thing. None of those items are dependent on the definition. The definitional ones are the ones like a square circle. Like a square is defined as something with 4 equal sides. So by definition, there cannot be a square circle. That's not a logical thing. That's a definitional thing.
All these questions are logically incoherent and cannot exist in any possible world, so you cannot expect them to be answered.
And again, those are definitionally impossible. Because we define purple as a color and not a shape, you cannot tell me the shape of purple. But omnipotence is defined as having the power to do anything, so logically impossible things should be possible for an omnipotent being.
Now you might be asking, well, why can't God do the logically impossible?
Probably because if he could, then he would be self-refuting. But since you don't need to go nearly as far as logical impossibilities to show God to be self-refuting, this ultimately doesn't even matter one way or the other.
He is all-powerful, so he should be able to do anything. Well, you need to understand that logic derives from order. Without order, nothing makes sense, including existence.
And all of these were created by God, right? So why can't he have done it differently?
So you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God. Because if logical absurdities were in a world along with God, then essentially nothing in that world could actually exist.
That's an excellent point. In that case, the ontological argument boils down to the world exists, therefore God does not. Well done.
So once again, you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God.
As long as you don't claim that God is omnipotent. If you want him to be omnipotent, then he has to be able to commit logical absurdities. By definition, that's one of those definitional things again. By definition, an omnipotent being can do anything. That includes logical absurdities.
Especially in modal logic. If one side uses logic to prove the existence of God, the other side cannot step outside of logic to disprove God.
In which case you don't have to use logical absurdities, you can just point out that the properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence are themselves logically absurd.
That'd be like a football game where one team gets to use machetes. This is why the omnipotence paradox is not accepted in academia as a valid argument.
Well, I've never really seen anyone rely on it too heavily anyways. It's more just poking fun. Anyways, at this point, he just directs you to another video of his that supposedly covers the other objections that I brought up, but I would have thought that those, being the better objections, would have been worth at least touching on in the video that claims the ontological argument to be the best argument in favor of a god. Guess not, though. Feel free to support me on Patreon and follow me on Twitter. See you next time!